Welcome to Midnight Mysteries. If you feel like listening to a horror story, you're in the right place. It was a serene summer evening in 1995, and at the time, I was an 18-year-old with a mind full of thoughts about the imminent final exams. In search of distraction, I found myself wandering aimlessly through the quiet streets of my small town near Naples. The full moon shone in the sky, bathing the streets in silver light and transforming every view into a timeless landscape. I found myself, almost without realizing it, in front of Villa Rospo. It was an old Vesuvius villa that had been abandoned for decades, a place I had always observed from afar when, especially as a child, I passed by it in the car on the way to my uncle's house. That evening, under the moonlight, the villa emanated a mysterious aura that seemed to draw me toward it. The iron gate, rusted and overrun with ivy, protested with a screech at my touch. Inside, the garden appeared wild and neglected, with tall weeds and brambles taking over the landscape. The moon, filtering through the trees, illuminated the path leading to the front door, whose rotted wood opened with a groan under the pressure of my hand. Crossing the threshold of Villa Rospo, I found myself immersed in an environment frozen in time. Dust reigned supreme, covering every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceilings like remnants of a forgotten time. The moonlight penetrated through the broken windows, outlining the contours of furniture covered with sheets, giving them a ghostly appearance. The parquet floor of the main hall, spacious and desolate, echoed under my steps. Every movement seemed to awaken the house from a deep sleep, and with it, a sense of apprehension slowly grew within me. In the living room, a rocking chair moved slightly. I stopped, watching it with curiosity and apprehension. Despite reasons suggesting it was just the wind moving the chair, in that context, the scene took on an eerie atmosphere. A cold shiver ran through me, and a primal instinct suggested I was not alone in that room. I stood still, staring at the rocking chair, which continued to move at a steady pace. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself there was nothing to fear, that it was just an old abandoned house and the wind passing through the broken windows was the cause of that impressive scene. But a subtle sense of terror had begun to creep inside me. I decided to explore the rest of the house, despite the anguish tightening my stomach. The corridors were long and dark, the moonlight barely illuminating their outlines. As I proceeded, every step seemed to echo infinitely in the empty rooms. I opened one room after another, discovering dusty and abandoned spaces where time seemed to have stood still. In one of the rooms, I found an old portrait hanging on the wall. It depicted a woman with a sad and distant look. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. It was as if the woman in the painting were still alive and trapped in that image. I stood staring at her for a few minutes, feeling a strange connection with her, as if she were trying to communicate something to me. I continued my exploration, but the deeper I ventured into the villa, the more my sense of unease grew. In one room, I found an old piano. Its strings produced discordant sounds when I touched them, resonating sinisterly in the dust-laden air. It was then that I heard a noise coming from the upper floor, like the creaking of the floorboards under the weight of footsteps. My first instinct was to run away, to leave that house and never return. But something held me back. It was as if an invisible force was pushing me to discover what was hidden upstairs. With my heart in my throat, I approached the stairs, the steps creaking under my weight. As I climbed the creaky stairs of Villa Rospo, each step seemed to echo through the oppressive silence of the house. The air was cold and dense, as if I were moving through an invisible fog. I reached the upper floor, where the corridor stretched out before me, dark and menacing. The moonlight, filtering weakly through the dirty windows, cast strange shadows along the walls. As I proceeded, a sense of anguish grew within me. Every room I checked seemed empty and abandoned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. At the end of the corridor, a slightly open door caught my attention because it was strangely illuminated. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. I pushed the door, which opened with a groan. The room, however, contrary to what it had seemed, was completely immersed in darkness, but the feeling that I was not alone was immediate. An intense cold enveloped me, and a faint whisper reached my ears. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, a veiled threat or a warning. I turned to flee, but a sudden noise startled me. The door behind me had slammed shut with a thud, trapping me in the room. My breathing became labored as I frantically tried to open the door, but it was as if it had been sealed by an invisible force. Suddenly, the room was illuminated by a flickering light. An old candelabrum on a desk had lit itself, casting a dim and eerie light. On the floor, I saw footprints, as if someone or something had walked with muddy feet. I followed the footprints with my eyes, which seemed to lead to a dark corner of the room. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. In the corner, I found an old mirror leaning against the wall. As I stared at it, my reflection began to distort, transforming into something horrible and unrecognizable. I felt a choked scream rise in my throat, but I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. It was then that I saw it. Behind me, in the reflection, a dark figure stood, with empty eyes and a malevolent smile. I turned sharply, but there was no one behind me. I looked back into the mirror, but the figure had disappeared, leaving me alone with my terrified reflection. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or think. The room seemed to close in around me, and the air was thick with palpable malevolence. I felt I had to escape, but I didn't know how. The air in the room had become unbreathable, heavy with a terror I could no longer deny. My mind screamed to flee, but my body seemed paralyzed. It was then that I heard another door slowly open behind me. With a determined effort, I turned towards the sound, my heart in my throat. Behind me, a door previously hidden by the shadow opened onto another room. I didn't remember seeing it when I entered. With a mix of terror and hope, I approached, praying to find a way out. The room, however, was empty except for an old trunk in a corner. I approached, curiosity battling with fear. When I opened the trunk, a musty, old smell hit me. Inside, there were old objects, yellowed photographs, and newspaper clippings. As I examined them, a chill ran through me. That house hid darker secrets than I had ever imagined. The whisper returned suddenly, stronger and more insistent. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was decisive and threatening. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and a sense of imminent danger pervaded me. By then, I was certain I was not alone, that something was hiding in that house, an entity that fed on fear and despair. Fear and despair tore me from the trance I had fallen into. I had to get out of that house at any cost. I rushed out of the room, running down the corridor to the stairs. I felt something behind me, a cold that came closer and closer. As I descended the stairs, I heard the steps of something or someone following me, a sound that chilled my blood. I reached the ground floor, stumbling and falling several times in my desperate escape. Finally, I reached the front door and pushed it open. The cold night air hit me like a punch to the jaw, but it was a relief compared to the oppressive air of the villa. Without looking back, I ran away from Villa Rospo, still feeling its malevolent breath on the back of my neck. I didn't stop until I reached the town square where all the kids gathered on Saturday nights to hang out. That evening, for the first time, the crowd didn't bother me. In fact, it made me feel safe. I don't know what was hiding in that house, but one thing was certain. I had brushed against something dark and malevolent, a reality that existed beyond my understanding. And every time I passed near that house, I felt the eyes of something watching me from the shadows, waiting.